All right, welcome everyone. Diving in today to something, well, I think really important, and close to the heart of a lot of people of faith. We're going to be talking about the rights and protection of orphans in Islam.
Mm-hmm.
And to do that, we've got some really incredible source material to work with.
Yes.
We're going to be looking at excerpts from the Quran, of course, as well as some key hadith.
Absolutely.
Really trying to get to the heart of, how this faith tradition views the care of some of the most vulnerable people in society. So, ready to jump in?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay. So, right off the bat, when we're looking at these foundational texts, one thing that really jumps out at me is that, the well-being of orphans is not just like a suggestion.
Right.
It's really baked into like the core of the ethics and even the law that we see in Islam.
Yeah, it's very central. And it's interesting because we see it sort of coming from both sides, right?
Yeah.
You have these moral and ethical obligations that are being discussed.
Right.
But it's also very much connected to sort of the legal structures as well.
Yeah. Like, it's not just be nice to orphans. It's like,
Yeah.
here's how you have to
This is how you structure society.
structure your society, actually.
To care for them. Make sure this happens.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which is fascinating. So let's look at some actual guidance from the Quran itself. One of the verses that always stands out to me, and I know a lot of our listeners are familiar with this, is from Surah Al-Baqarah. So for our listeners, again, Surah is a chapter in the Quran. And this is from verse 220 of the second chapter, Al-Baqarah.
Okay.
And it says, and they ask you about orphans. Say, improving their lot is best. So, on the surface, pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
But what's interesting to me is this phrase, improving their lot. Like, it feels so much bigger than just, meeting basic needs.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. It's not just about saying, okay, we'll make sure that they have, food to eat and a roof over their heads.
Right.
It's actually talking about actively improving their situation.
Yeah.
And I think the Arabic word that's used there really does have that sense of elevating them.
Yeah, like uplift.
Yeah, uplifting them.
Right.
So it's suggesting that society has this obligation to actively make things better for them.
Yeah, to dismantle like whatever barriers are
Exactly.
in place and really create opportunity.
Yeah, and it encompasses their well-being in a very holistic way.
Okay.
We're talking about their emotional well-being, educational opportunities,
Right.
spiritual development, in this life and in the hereafter. So it's a very, very proactive and holistic approach.
So it's about the whole person,
Absolutely.
not just are they alive?
Exactly.
Okay, interesting. Then we also have this very strong warning in Surah An-Nisa, and this is verse 10. It says, indeed, those who consume the wealth of orphans unjustly are only consuming fire into their bellies, and they will be burned in a blaze. Whew, pretty intense imagery.
It's very stark. And I think what's really, I guess, coming through very strongly there is the sanctity of an orphan's wealth.
Yeah.
So it's not just a suggestion. It's really this very severe warning against any form of exploitation or mismanagement of their financial resources.
Do you think that's because like they're so vulnerable to that?
I think absolutely.
Yeah.
If you think about it, if someone is, a child and they've lost their parents,
Yeah.
they're incredibly vulnerable to people who might take advantage of that situation.
Right.
And so this verse is really highlighting the fact that their wealth is sacred and that those who are responsible for it have a huge responsibility. It's like, they've been entrusted with this precious gift, right? For someone who can't care for it themselves.
Right.
And so you have to protect it and grow it for them, not use it for your own benefit.
Right. And it's not just, a legal thing. It's like you're going to be held accountable for this.
Exactly. There are profound spiritual consequences in Islamic belief for violating that trust.
Wow. Now, this next one is a little bit of a different angle, but I think it speaks to, again, just this broader context of how Islam views the care of the vulnerable. Okay. So this is from Surah Al-Isra, and this is verse 31, and it says, and do not kill your children for fear of poverty. We provide for them and for you. So not directly about orphans.
Right.
But I think it's connected. What do you think?
I think it absolutely is. And I think, again, if we sort of connect this to the bigger picture,
Yeah.
it's speaking to this belief in divine provision.
Okay.
Right. And it's discouraging people from harming the vulnerable out of this fear of scarcity.
So it's like, God will provide for all us,
Right.
including orphans, so don't
worry.
freak out and,
Right.
do something you'll regret.
Yeah. And I mean, this verse is directly addressing the practice of infanticide,
Right.
Which was prevalent in some societies at the time.
Right.
But I think it also indirectly reinforces this idea that children, including orphans, are to be cared for.
Mm-hmm.
They're not to be seen as a burden.
Right, right.
And that ultimately God is the provider for everyone.
Okay, then there's Surah Ad-Duha 93.910, and those verses, man, they feel so direct, like a personal call to action almost.
Yeah, totally. They say, "Therefore, do not oppress the orphan, nor repulse the petitioner, and proclaim the bounty of your Lord." It's like no ifs, ands, or buts. It's a straight-up prohibition against oppressing orphans.
Yeah, it's not just like, oh, be nice to orphans. It's like, don't you dare mistreat them.
Exactly. And then it ties that in with being grateful for all the good things God has given you.
Yeah.
Like how you treat those who are vulnerable is a reflection of, how much you really appreciate God's blessings.
And then things get even more like nitty-gritty in Surah An-Nisa 4.23 and 4.6. That's where we see all this stuff about finances and protecting the property of orphans.
Yeah, totally. This is where the rubber meets the road,
Yeah.
It lays out the specifics of what you need to do financially for orphans. Like you have to give them what's rightfully theirs, their property, and you absolutely cannot trade their good stuff for bad stuff or use their wealth for your own benefit. He says that's a great sin.
Great sin. That's pretty serious. It's not messing around.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It emphasizes that you're being trusted with something really important, to manage their money until they're old enough to handle it themselves.
That idea of a great sin, it just carries so much weight, It's clearly not just some minor thing. It's really putting the exploitation of an orphan's wealth on a whole other level of seriousness. And the specific instruction to not even mix their property with your own. It's like, don't even get close to doing anything that could be seen as unfair or taking advantage. Is there like historical context here? Was there something going on back then that made this such a big issue?
That's a good question. I mean, the Quran's guidance is timeless, but the context can definitely help us understand it better. Back then, just like in a lot of societies, orphans were often really vulnerable to being exploited financially. These verses were like a safeguard, setting clear boundaries to protect their rights in a society where they might otherwise be taken advantage of. And then, as you mentioned, when the orphan reaches maturity, there are very specific guidelines for, testing their judgment before giving them full control over their property. It's about making sure they're ready.
So it's not just like, oh, here you go, good luck. It's making sure they're actually prepared to manage their own affairs.
It's exactly.
Okay, and then there's Surah Al-Man 107.1 then 3, and this one feels a little different. It seems to be more about the character of the person who mistreats orphans.
Yeah, it's really powerful. It asks, have you seen the one who denies the recompense? For that is the one who drives away the orphan. So it's not just a social commentary. It's saying that how you treat orphans is actually connected to your faith.
Like a test of your sincerity almost.
Right. It makes you think, if you mistreat orphans, are you really living your faith? Because real belief should show up in how you treat the most vulnerable people.
So we're seeing this really strong and consistent message from the Quran. Caring for orphans is essential. Any kind of oppression or neglect is completely forbidden. Their property has to be treated as sacred. And if you ignore their needs, you're in serious trouble spiritually.
Right. It's a big deal.
It is. Okay, so let's move on to the hadith now, the sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. The first one you picked out is from Sahih Bukhari 6005, and it's pretty intense.
It really is. And it's from Sahih Bukhari, which is one of the most authentic collections of hadith. So we know this is something the Prophet, peace be upon him, actually said.
Right. So what does it say?
The Prophet Muhammad says, "I and the guardian of an orphan are like these two in paradise." And he held up his index and middle fingers slightly separated.
So he's actually showing.
He's showing.
With his hand?
With his hand.
Yeah, wow, that's so powerful.
It is. I mean, think about it.
Yeah.
The Prophet Muhammad is saying that those who care for orphans will be in close proximity to him in paradise.
Right.
And in Islamic belief, paradise is the ultimate reward.
Yeah. So that's a huge...
It's huge. It's a huge promise. And you can just imagine, the impact that would have had on the people who heard him say that.
Yeah. You can almost feel that,
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, what else?
So then we have another hadith in Sunan ibn Majah.
Okay.
Which is another important collection of hadith. And in this hadith, it says, The best house among the Muslims is the house where there is an orphan who is treated well. So it's interesting because it kind of shifts the focus a little bit.
It does, yeah. So instead of focusing on, the reward of the person taking care,
Right.
it's talking about the impact on the whole house.
Exactly. It's saying that a house that embraces an orphan and cares for them with kindness is considered the best house.
So, like, it makes it a blessed house.
Yes. Blessed, virtuous.
Yeah.
It suggests that this act of compassion creates this really beautiful, positive environment for everyone.
That's so lovely. So really what we're seeing is that this is a moral and ethical imperative for, Muslims.
Yeah.
It's not if you feel like it. This is a part of your...
This is a duty. It's a fundamental duty.
Yeah, and this is something that I've thought about a lot. The fact that orphans are mentioned so much in these texts, it really points to their vulnerability.
Absolutely. I mean, they've lost that parental support, right? That safety net.
Yeah.
Which makes them so much more susceptible to hardship,
right?
To exploitation, to abuse.
Right. And I think that's probably why, we see such a strong emphasis on the sanctity of their wealth. Because, you can just imagine, right? If you have someone who's young, who's grieving, doesn't have that
support,
parental support, like it's so easy to take advantage of them.
Absolutely. And so these warnings are really there to serve as a deterrent.
Yeah.
But it's not just about avoiding harm.
Right.
It's also about this idea of spiritual elevation through caring for orphans.
Yeah, and we see that so clearly in that hadith, right? Like, the Prophet Muhammad saying you're going to be close to him in paradise. Yeah,
that connection between caring for orphans and achieving closeness to God is very powerful. Okay, then we had this hadith from Sahih Muslim 2982, which is a bit more of a warning.
Uh-oh.
It lists devouring the property of orphans as one of the 7 destructive sins.
Ooh, 7 destructive sins. So up there with like really, really bad stuff.
Yeah. You've got things like associating partners with God, witchcraft, killing someone unjustly. It really shows how serious this is. It's not just a financial mistake. It's a deep moral and spiritual wrong.
Wow. Okay, and lastly, we have a hadith from Musnad Ahmad 22809. And this one seems to be about how this should play out in our daily lives, in our homes and communities.
Yeah, this one says, the best house among Muslims is one where an orphan is treated kindly, and the worst is one where an orphan is wronged. So it's bringing it down to the individual level, right, to our families and communities.
Like how we treat orphans is a reflection of how good our homes and communities are.
Exactly.
So taking all of this together, the Quranic verses, the hadith, what's the main message here? Like, what's so important about caring for orphans in Islam?
Well, what we see is that it's way more than just charity. It's a core part of Islamic social justice. Orphans are, by their very nature, vulnerable. So protecting them is a way of showing taqwa, guard consciousness.
Right, like you're showing that you understand your responsibilities to God.
Yeah, and you're fulfilling the amana, the trust God has given you to care for those who can't care for themselves.
So it's not optional, it's a duty.
Exactly.
Okay, so you mentioned a few key principles that come out of all this. Justice, compassion, and accountability. Can you break those down for us a little more?
Sure. So justice, alal, means making sure orphans get their fair share financially, just like Surah An-Nisa emphasizes. But it's more than that. It's also about treating them fairly in every way, not discriminating against them, and making sure they're emotionally okay. We see this concept of waqf, which are essentially endowments.
Right.
And these were often set up to establish and fund orphanages, to provide for the needs of orphans.
Right, right.
So that was sort of, a very concrete way that society would come together to fulfill this obligation.
Okay, so beyond that, it's not just about the practicalities, though.
No, and I think this is really important.
Yeah.
The sources also highlight the need for compassion.
Okay.
For integrity, for kindness in all our interactions with orphans, creating a nurturing environment for them where they feel safe.
So like their emotional needs.
Their emotional needs are just as important.
Okay, so what are some of the things that, our listeners can maybe think about doing in their own lives?
Well, I mean, there are so many ways to get involved.
Okay.
For example, participating in orphan care programs.
Yeah.
Whether those are NGOs or, local community initiatives.
Right. And I mean, there's so many great organizations out there.
There are.
That are already doing this work.
Exactly. So, getting involved with organizations that have the infrastructure, the expertise to provide that comprehensive support is one great way. Another thing is, promoting awareness within the community.
Okay.
Educating others about the rights of orphans. Talking to your friends, talking to your family about the importance of this.
Yeah.
And then, of course, direct support.
Right.
Whether that's, volunteering your time at an orphanage or providing financial contributions.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to remember that support should go beyond just basic needs. It should encompass education, emotional growth.
It's about investing.
It's about investing
with your future.
In their future. Exactly.
Okay. Now, I do think it's important to address some of the misconceptions around this topic because sometimes people might think that, orphan care is just, for governments or big charities.
Yeah, I think that's a common misconception. But I think what's fascinating here is that the sources really emphasize that it's a collective responsibility.
Right.
It starts at the individual level, at the community level.
Yeah.
It's something that families, neighborhoods, all have a role to play in.
So it's like, we can't just outsource this.
Right.
It's something that we have to take ownership of.
Exactly. And I think, if you think about, traditional societies, for example, often, if a child lost their parents, it would be the neighbors. Right. It would be the extended family who would step in.
Yeah.
And I think that's really the spirit of this teaching.
Okay. And another misconception I think that can happen is that people might think of orphans, just as charity cases. And I think, that can lead to a lack of respect for them.
Absolutely. I mean, it's important to remember that they're individuals, right? With their own rights, their own dignity. And so the focus should really be on, recognizing that. Yeah. And providing them with long-term support.
Yeah, not just a handout.
Not just a handout, exactly.
It's about integrating them into society.
Exactly. It's about empowerment.
Yeah.
It's about helping them to become self-sufficient.
Right, and not just, oh, here's some money. No, let's actually invest in you as a person.
Exactly.
Okay. So really fascinating to go through all of this. I mean, I think it's so clear, right, that this is not a minor issue in Islam. This is central to
it's a core value
in the faith. Yeah,
absolutely.
And it speaks to these values of justice, of compassion, of community.
Absolutely.
That I think we see, throughout the Quran and Hadith.
And I think it's beautiful because it's both a spiritual obligation,
right,
and a very practical one.
Yeah.
It's about how we live our lives, how we structure our societies,
right,
and how we care for those who are most in need.
Yeah, this has been really, really insightful. I want to leave our listeners with a final thought and maybe something to think about as you sort of go through your day. We've been talking specifically about Islam, but I think these teachings, these principles about caring for the vulnerable, they have so much relevance, I think, for all of us. Absolutely. So no matter what your background is, think about how these ancient teachings might speak to some of the challenges that we see today. How can we as individuals, how can we as communities do a better job of supporting those who are most vulnerable? Yeah. And are there maybe some universal principles here that we can all learn from? So something to think about. So how does all of this translate into actual practical advice for Muslims? What are some concrete ways they can apply these principles?
Well, there are a few key areas. First, there's the financial responsibility. Muslims who can afford it are obligated to pay zakat, which is a kind of annual charity, and sadaqah, which is voluntary charity. And these can be used to support orphans, like Quran 2.177 encourages.
Right, so putting your money where your mouth is, so to speak.
Exactly. Then there's emotional guardianship, or kafala. This is about taking care of an orphan as if they were your own child, making them feel loved and part of the family.
And not just providing for them, but actually bonding with them.
Exactly. And, there's that hadith about being close to the prophet in paradise for those who care for orphans. It really shows how important this emotional connection is.
Yeah, that one's hard to forget. Okay, so beyond the financial and emotional support, what about the ethical side of things?
That's crucial too. It's about avoiding gulu, which is basically any kind of dishonesty or betrayal of trust when handling an orphan's property.
Right, no shady dealings.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it also means getting advice from scholars on things like inheritance laws, as Quran 4.2 says, to make sure you're doing everything right by the orphan.
So Islam provides guidance on every level, from the practical to the spiritual, and from individual actions to community-wide solutions. It's pretty impressive.
It is. It's a whole system designed to ensure the well-being of orphans.
Okay, now, sometimes with topics like this, there can be some misunderstandings. What are some of the common misconceptions about orphan care in Islam that you think are important to clear up?
Yeah, that's a good point. One big one is the difference between tabani and kafala. Tabani is like adoption, where you completely erase the child's biological family and pretend they're your own. That's actually forbidden in Islam, as Quran 33.45 explains. Lineage is really important. But kafala is encouraged. That's fostering, where you take care of the child, but they still maintain their original family identity.
So fostering good, adoption not so much.
Exactly. Another misconception is that neglecting an orphan just means not giving them food or shelter. But Islam also condemns emotional neglect. Like, there's a hadith that says even wiping away an orphan's tears brings a huge reward.
So it's not just about meeting their physical needs, it's about their emotional well-being too.
Exactly. And finally, there's this idea of collective duty called fard kifaya. Basically, it means that if the community as a whole isn't taking care of orphans, then it becomes an individual obligation, fard ain, for those who can help.
So it's everyone's responsibility, but if others aren't stepping up, it becomes your personal duty.
Right.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, can you sum up the main takeaways for us?
Sure. I think the biggest one is that caring for orphans in Islam is a divine command. It's not just a suggestion, it's a core part of the faith. And it's not just about money, it's about holistic care, financial, emotional, ethical. And there's a huge spiritual reward for those who do it, like that beautiful image of being close to the prophet in paradise.
Yeah, that image is going to stick with me for a while.
Me too. And lastly, we saw that it takes both individual effort and systemic solutions to really address the needs of orphans.
So strong laws and institutions, plus a culture of compassion and individual responsibility.
Exactly.
Now, from all the sources we looked at, is there one particular statement or verse that really sums up this whole teaching on orphan care for you?
You know, what really struck me is the idea that how a community treats its orphans is a reflection of its morality. It's like a litmus test. And there's a really powerful verse from the Quran, Surah Al-Balad, 90.12, day 15, that talks about how feeding an orphan in times of hardship is like climbing a steep path. It's hard, but it leads you to something truly great.
Wow, that's a great way to put it. Well, thank you so much for taking us on this deep dive. It's been incredibly insightful.
My pleasure. It's always a privilege to delve into these teachings.
And to all our listeners, thanks for joining us on the deep dive. You guys sent us some amazing material that really allowed us to explore the Islamic teachings on orphan care in depth. Now, as you go about your day, we want you to think about this. How can these principles of orphan care, which are so deeply rooted in compassion and justice, inspire us to support all vulnerable children, regardless of their background? What can we do, both individually and as a society, to make sure that every child has the chance to thrive? Keep those questions in mind, and thanks again for joining us.